Hello, hello, and good morning. Welcome to our very first session of the Art of Effective Management. So, I am very excited to kick off this series for a second time. We first did this series when we were just getting started into the webinar space, and we were starting to get a feel for what was going to be of value and impact. And this series did phenomenally well. So, we have about 3 minutes to before we go live with the starting time. So just sit tight and we'll be with you right at 10 o'clock. All right, so we're at the top of the hour. We can go ahead and get started. So, thank you again for joining on this Friday morning. It's a little bit windy in my area. I'm not sure if it's windy on your end, but stay warm and definitely grab a cup of coffee as we walk through the first session of this series. So, if you haven't met me before, I'm Dr. Myra Austin. I am the CEO and founder of Management Cues. And so, I'll share a little bit about that. But today we're going to be focusing on defining what effective management is, what it looks like, and what type of a framework to follow. And I think that this is really important because, at least in my experience, both with clients and just growing up as and maturing as a manager, I wasn't familiar with what those functions were. And once I understood the importance of them, I started to see the difference between the outcomes that I was getting before and after. So that's what we're going to focus on for this first session. And this session is definitely an introduction to more depth as we go through the series. So make sure to follow along. So, like I mentioned, I'm Dr. Myra Austin. I'm super excited to be here today. I love doing these webinars, and accessibility for us is something that's really important at Management Cues. We want to make sure to reach audiences with effective types of frameworks and tactics that managers can put into play right away. So, who is Management Cues? So, in a nutshell, we're a management training company that's scientifically proven to work. We've tested our framework and our approach through neuroscience. We've had neuroscientists and neuroengineers test our approach and prove and and identify amazing results. And so that's what we focus on is the manager's experience, what they're living through, how they learn, and what they hate and what burns them out. All of those things are incredibly important to us. And so we try to put impactful, effective things together. So what we're going to cover today is going to be how we cover things every week for these 5 week series. So we're going to focus on an overview. We're going to break things down to its core and fundamentals, and then we're going to go through the important takeaways for each session, and then we'll share some resources in case you want to take your learning a step further, and then we'll close it out. Okay, so here we go. Let's dive in. So to begin with, effective management is not just management, right? There's a little bit more beef to it. There's a little bit more to the depth that it requires. It's really the ability for managers to achieve organizational goals. And so that requires the manager to be in tune, to understand what role to play, to understand how to direct their team, how to keep them motivated, engaged. There's so much to it. It's executing across all of the management functions. So the challenge there is if you don't know what those functions are and you're not comfortable with them and you're not exercising through those functions, you're missing a component that's valuable to management, and it's realized execution. Effective management really means being aware of the type of role that you have and what that means organizationally. Effective management from a neuroscience perspective, which we back and support and frame our approach through neuroscience, is creating an environment that lowers cognitive stress, supports decisions, and aligns rewards and feedback with the management functions, these 5 management functions. So what's interesting about that is learning how the minds of our team members work. That's depth, right? Like that requires training. That does not come natural, right? So effective training requires a component of it. And sometimes we don't know to ask for it, and we're just not familiar with it. And sometimes our leadership team isn't either, right? So the first question to kind of set the stage, right? And you don't have to answer this right now, just sit with it a little bit, is do you know what the 5 management functions are? Because that's the starting point, right? That's where you want to gauge what value you're going to gain out of this session and this series, but also, are you managing right? Right? Are you being the maximum that you could be out there? And is this limiting your impact, not knowing what these are? So I'm a big history buff. I love history. I think it tells us the patterns that humanity has. I think it tells us what mistakes not to repeat. And I think it teaches us the why behind certain systemic frameworks and just why we do the things we do, right? So here's a little history about management. And I'm very nerdy about this, very passionate about it. But the concept of management has been around for thousands of years. In the 19th century, Henry Fayol, a French mining engineer, developed these 5 primary functions. So these primary functions are not new. We definitely did not invent them, and we definitely didn't theorize them. They've been around for quite a bit of time, but it's only management enthusiasts and managers who have mastery around the function and role of managers that really dig into these functions and understand what it looks like once you're exercising them. So Henry recognized that the skills that made them good at their jobs didn't necessarily make them good managers. So it's really interesting because he made the distinction of who is in a position to be a manager and be effective, and who just needs to remain a team member or an individual contributor, which is how we refer to those team members now. So Socrates, around 400 BC, stated that management was competency, distinctly separate from possessing technical skills and knowledge. So interesting, so far, way back, already the distinction was being made between those who are a good fit for the position and those who are not. And it's important to recognize where we stand, especially if we are managers right now. So here are the 5 management functions. And I can tell you that we actually frame our training around these functions, which is why it's part of the reason it's so effective is because the framework is solid, right? So the five functions are planning, organizing, staffing, coordinating, and controlling. So today we're going to take a superficial dive just to frame things for the series and to get you familiar with what those are and what they mean. So planning, that involves setting objectives, determining a course of action. It means being aware of where your organization is going, where it's headed. It means being informed about what resources are available to you. And it means identifying when timing is right or appropriate for execution. It's not always right to just follow orders. It's not always geared towards the best outcome. And so managers, they work as a linchpin, they work as a conduit. And when they don't realize that aspect of their role, sometimes they just go with the flow and in doing so become less impactful. And so it's important to understand that planning function. So organizing. So for a manager, what the function of organizing means, it means creating order with people and resources available. So it requires a high degree of awareness. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone into organizations or have been hired to manage teams, and the managers aren't aware of what resources are fully available to their teams, or what benefits have been outlined and how they work and how to use them. And so this includes that resource component, understanding all of those things, understanding your employee handbook inside and out is a great example of something that I commonly see. So making tools and resources orderly and available to your teams is part of organizing. So again, requires a very high degree of self-awareness. Distributing planned work, right? Understanding what it looks like, big picture. Developing an organizational structure, making things make sense is part of the organizing function for a manager. And so when we leave it up to leaders, right? When we leave it up to the executive leaders, for example, or we leave it up to HR, we're actually falling short as managers and we're not equipping ourselves to be more impactful. So the most controversial function of these five functions, in my experience, and this is completely based on what I've observed and in my own experience, is the staffing function. And I think this function goes underutilized. I think that managers typically don't flex this muscle in the right way or don't know that they're supposed to. And a lot of impact is left on the table because as managers, we have key insights. We are the relationship builders. We are the gatekeepers in our organizations. And so this is one of the areas that I come in and shift typically when I'm working with either clients or, again, if I am being hired by an employer. But it's recruiting, the role that a manager plays in the recruiting exercise or function or need. That is something that is an opportunity to be maximized and aligns things with organizational goals and direction. Training. What kind of training works for our team? Am I advocating enough? Is there training that was phenomenal that your team loved? Are you telling your leaders, this is what works for us? Here's how it benefits us. Here's why we want to continue. If you're not, you're leaving impact on the table because you're the one with the insight. Developing, helping others on a career path, which includes a component of mentorship. And so if we, as managers, if we don't know how to be effective mentors, again, we're leaving impact on the table. Appraising, how to evaluate performance, how to be confident, how to give constructive feedback. All of these things are part of the staffing function. And I've seen it left largely up to HR as a point of escalation, which is a huge miss, both from a management function and from an organizational culture aspect. And then last but definitely not least, promoting. Again, managers have so much day-to-day input, have so much awareness around the output in organizations and how people feel and what works and what really doesn't, that when the manager holds back and isn't fully realized in the staffing function, you're actually becoming a cost and not an asset to the business in your role. And so, again, this is the most controversial one out of all of the five functions. So coordinating. Coordinating means the manager is ensuring. They're ensuring departments and team members are in sync, which means that there's a healthy flow, right? If there's a lot of miscommunication, if there's a lot of, I didn't say that, that's not what I meant, those are all cues, right? And of course, we love our cues at management cues. I think that is what makes the difference for managers in real life is seeing those cues and knowing what they mean, right? So if that's happening, as a manager, we're not ensuring that there's a flow. It's communicating effectively. It's documenting the right things and the right interactions and knowing what the next step looks like collectively, right? Because as a manager, you're creating that kind of team concept vibe and unit type of mentality. And it's bringing harmony and execution in tasks and responsibilities. Getting things done is not enough. And I can tell you that with AI coming in and transforming workplace environments, it's going to take up a lot of the getting done part. And so, what you're going to be left with as managers is your understanding of the five functions and how well you know to navigate them and execute them. So, the five functions definitely a competitive advantage for managers. Controlling is my favorite function to elaborate on and to train on because there's so many myths around what controlling in management looks like. So the controlling function in management refers to organizational control, not being controlling, right? A manager that's controlling is an ineffective manager, and is micromanaging, is not delegating, is not developing other leaders, is the kind of manager who is thinking, I'm the one who knows how to do it. I'm just going to get it done. So if you're framing things in that way, you're misusing the controlling function within management, but you also probably need to work on the understanding of it a little bit more, right? So, controlling as a management function means creating organizational control. It means making sure we have checks and balances that help our teams be successful. It means establishing standards, an expectation for our team of how we communicate, how we do things, how we fail, actually, right? Helping teams fail forward and feeling okay. That creates psychological safety, and that can be done through effective controls. Measuring performance so that we know what areas we need to work on and which areas we're winning at. Auditing process and workflows. One of my favorite things to do. I know it's not for everybody, but it's definitely something that I love doing because when you have a streamlined process, everything becomes easier, more effective, and ensuring controls are in place in day-to-day operations. For me, in my practice, whenever I am managing, I look at my controls in place every year at the end of the year. And I check whether they're still working, whether they're still relevant, whether they're outdated, whether it's time to rethink these controls. And so that's kind of the effectiveness around understanding these functions. It's knowing to do that and that's part of your role, right? And that's how you contribute. So why are these five functions of management so important? Well, I shared a little bit along the way, but in a snapshot, if I were to take a screenshot of anything in this webinar, it would probably be this slide because this is the reason why, right? This is the why. So when planning as a function in management fails, there are planning gaps, which means that equals reactive firefighting cultures. And so, if you're in a reactive firefighting culture, and if that's true, you probably haven't fully realized your planning function as managers, either as a team or individually. Organizing, when that function fails, there are organizing failures, which typically result in role confusion and silos across the company. So if you're feeling like one hand doesn't know what the other does, or there's overlap between roles and functions, there's an organizing function failure there between managers. Staffing blind spots. So when staffing doesn't work, there's talent misalignment. You miss the boat, you lose people. That's what that means. When the coordinating function fails, there are coordination breakdowns, which ultimately, at the end of the day, results in low trust and motivation with your team and other leaders. And then controlling. When controlling fails as a function for a manager, there is controlling weakness, which that to me is incredibly costly as an operations leader in my career over 20 years. That costs a lot of money for organizations. So that ultimately results in risk, drift, and surprise outcomes, right? That ultimately could be very damaging when we don't realize our function. So we're going to break these down so that it's very clear why these functions are so important and why we're framing what we do on these functions to start. So planning gaps. What goes wrong when there are planning gaps? There are no clear goals, priorities, or success metrics. There's short-term thinking that starts to replace strategic direction, right? You have a kind of like a default mentality. Teams are constantly busy, but they're not necessarily productive. When you're productive, you're impactful, you're achieving, you're growing, you're scaling, right? When you're not productive, you're stuck and you're doing the same things over and over again. And the impact that takes place there is typically represented in day-to-day things like missed deadlines, shifting expectations, burning out constantly, which gets you to really unhappy managers and it filters through the organization. Leaders making mistakes and aren't checking in on progress, right? That's what happens when planning gaps take place. So here's the common myth around planning. We'll figure it out as we go. That never works from a management function when it comes to the planning function. There's a specific role that the manager is intended to play when that role is realized effectively. So if you have that kind of response, or many of your managers in your environment have that, we'll figure it out as we go, there's weakness in the planning function. So organizing failures. What goes wrong when there are organizing failures? Well, there's unclear responsibilities and decision rights. Who makes what decision? If decisions in your environment take weeks, there's something going on with the organization function and your managers aren't strong enough in that area, and probably your leaders. There's duplicated work or critical tasks that are falling through the cracks. There's poor workflow design. There's just not an effective flow there. And so what does the impact look like? Well, it looks like frustration and blame between teams. If there's finger pointing, there's an organization function gap there. Inefficient use of resources. We don't know what we have access to. We don't know who has approval for what. We don't know when we ran out of something. Those are all organization function flaws. Managers are over involved in work they shouldn't be doing. That becomes a trap. And we do separate training around delegation, but that goes into ineffective delegation taking place or not at all, right? And so that's an organization function flaw. So what's the red flag there? The red flag with the organization function is I thought they were handling that approach, right? If that's your default thing, or you catch yourself saying that, or you catch others saying it, you have a function flaw. You have a function gap, or there's just more training that's needed. Because the reality is that when you're fully realized in this function, your response is, I've got this. This is where the breakdown took place. This is what we're going to reiterate, right? This is what we're going to fix. And so pushing it over to, I thought, coulda, woulda, shoulda, right? It's not an effective way to realize your role. So staffing blind spots. So again, this is the controversial function, right? The one that always seems to surprise our clients in training. So what goes wrong? Well, typically there's a hiring for urgency instead of fit, right? If you find yourself in an organization where you're constantly looking for talent, and you seem to have a shortage because the turnover is so high, you have a staffing function issue, right? So no clear onboarding, development, or succession planning. If your training is spotty and it's not consistent, and there's not a plan for development or training that you cycle through each year, that's a problem, right? And so high performers end up being overused and others end up being underutilized. And so that becomes this terrible way to chase your tail from an organization perspective, not to mention you're leaving impact and sacrificing cost where you could be using those resources elsewhere if you had the staffing function fully covered. So what's the impact there? The impact is high turnover and disengagement, skills gaps that show up as performance problems, and managers spending excessive time fixing people. And so if that's what it feels like, there's a huge staffing gap there with your manager's execution of this function. And the reality is that sometimes we think that skills gaps are people problems, that they're not good workers because they can't do something, when the reality is the skill hasn't been trained. Maybe you've done on the job training as to how the job works. That's different from developing skill, right? So not making these distinctions, it creates a shortage in that staffing gap. So the reality check there is most performance issues are staffing and development failures, not attitude problems. So as managers, when we're frustrated and we're burnt out and we're not executing the staffing function correctly, we're not realizing that it's a development failure because we're not realizing that function effectively, right? And so we blame. And I've seen that over and over again. And there hasn't been an organization yet that I have seen capture this nuance very well, right? So check for those things in your environment. The coordinating breakdown. So, what goes wrong when there are coordinating breakdowns? There's inconsistent communication, managers default to authority instead of influence, and the feedback is avoided or delivered poorly, which both of those situations is a negative in the bank, right? Both of those is a deficit and impact from a management perspective. So, what's the impact? So, psychological safety has been very popular, and it's trending for 2026 as a topic that people want to understand better. So there are things that we do that lend to psychological safety, and coordinating is one of those things that actually lends to psychological safety. And it's not fancy, it just is. When people have clear channels, when people have an expectation or a standard, um, their psychological safety naturally increases. But when there's the opposite of that, it actually erodes psychological safety. So we want to be careful as managers not to focus on terminology and understand what it is that we're doing in our interactions. It's part of the reason we focus so much on neuroscience and understanding what happens in somebody's brain when we do certain things. So employees disengage or go silent. When coordinating is too difficult, when it wears you too thin, people become frustrated and they either complain or they completely shut down. And as managers, we may not pay attention to somebody that's silent as much as somebody who is the squeaky wheel, and it's still costing us. So managers rely on control instead of clarity. So when coordination breaks down, we get frustrated as managers. And I've seen this often as well, right? And so we rely then on our authority, and it's the because I said so type of mentality, and not because we're in partnership, let's figure this out. And I think that that's where we go low as managers, and we don't maximize our role. So the telltale sign when it comes to that function is teams comply but don't commit. So as managers, we have to think about things with depth, right? Do we want people to do it, or do we want people to do it right, to do it better, to work towards growth and momentum? The reality is that we want the latter, right? We don't want people to just check a box. That's not actually going to lead to success, right? In most cases. So, controlling weaknesses, what goes wrong? There's typically no monitoring systems or follow up. There's managers who are avoiding metrics or are overusing them punitively, which means you're using KPIs to punish people, not to actually create momentum, not to celebrate, not to identify what else needs to be tracked in the organization. And problems are typically discovered when they're too late, and there's typically resentment around KPI tracking in a team. And when that's the case, that's not serving you, right? So the impact there is quality issues, compliance risks, and time spent on rework. And let me tell you that as an ops leader, if you're not tracking rework time, That is a completely miss opportunity for an organization because that is extremely costly, right? Especially from a manager's perspective. If the manager is going in and reworking things for people, you're not maximizing that manager. So leaders are surprised by outcomes they should have seen coming. And accountability feels personal instead of process based, right? So it's important to make these distinctions. That's what makes you more effective. So here's the key miss with control. Control is about learning and course correction, not punishment. So as managers, if we're using these controls like KPIs to punish, we are really missing the mark with people, right? And we're actually limiting our department, our organization, our team growth and development. So, the bigger organizational cost. So, here's the big picture. Sometimes we keep managers, and I've seen this as well with executive leaders, we keep them in a box and we don't teach them how to look at things from a bigger perspective, a wider perspective, and that limits their impact. So, here's the big picture. When managers don't understand the five functions as an integrated systems, as integrated system and an organizational experience, this happens. There's chronic inefficiency. There's manager stress and overload, cognitive overload, which means it becomes more difficult to manage to make good decisions. There are culture initiatives that fail despite the good intentions, and there are leaders promoted without the tools that they actually need. Ultimately, what this is exactly why tactical management mastery matters, not just leadership inspiration, right? So it's one of the reasons why at Management Cues we focus on tactics and what's happening in the brain. What is the manager experiencing versus just speaking to theory or only focusing on leadership, right? So key differences there. Okay, so as we come to the end today, and please excuse any excess noise in the background. I have two puppies that we're training. The key takeaways here are recognize the five primary functions. Neuroscience insight is this. Focusing attention on clearly defined core functions reduces cognitive overload. And you want to reduce the cognitive overload because that's the effort that goes into things. You want it to be easy to make decisions, easy to course correct, and improve the way that you make decisions. Be self aware. Neuroscience insight is this. Self awareness activates the prefrontal cortex, improving emotional regulation, impulse control, and social cognition in teams' interactions. So understand that your awareness impacts your entire team. Own your role and fulfill core functions. The neuro insight is this. Consistent execution strengthens neural pathways associated with habit forming, reinforcing reliable manager behavior. Right? So there's a difference between managing and then realizing the role within management. Guide and monitor team member experiences. Neuroscience insight is this. Observing and reflecting on team dynamics engages mirror neuron networks, enhancing empathy and the ability to anticipate team needs. Now, empathy is one of those other things that is very popular in 2026 and will continue to be because it's separate and it's something technology like AI can't compete with. It's a very humanistic thing, but we don't do it very well, in my opinion, in the workforce. So that's where you want to grow. Keep your eye on the big picture. And last, discipline and practice is essential. These things are not easy, they are a discipline. And the neuroscience insight is this: repetition and deliberate practice strengthen synaptic connections, making effective management behaviors more automatic and resilient under stress. Things become easier, decision making becomes better. You actually start enjoying management to a different degree, right? And so those are the key takeaways for this first session. So with that said, I'll wait a few seconds to see if you have any questions in chat, and I'll take a look on YouTube as we are streaming live to see if we have any questions. And if we don't, I will go ahead and move for our close. And I hope you've enjoyed this very first week one session. So here we go. We're going to go ahead and close. I don't see any questions, but if you have questions, feel free to email me at any time. So training and support resources. You'll get a session recording, a copy of a webinar deck. Excuse my puppy. Actually, give me a second. Let me put her down. Okay. Okay. And down from furniture is what I meant. So training and support resources. Training programs are available. Feel free to check them out online at www.managementcues.com. We offer a management planner that actually encompasses guided work through these functions of management and the functions of leadership. And you can access our neuroscience studies in case you love research and are a science geek like we are. You could check those out, download, and get a feel for what the kind of work that we've done and why we're tested and proven to work. And if you have any questions for me personally and would like to have an hour with me, a free consultation time, feel free to click on the link in the deck that you're going to get, and you can do that. We also have management membership programs, and those programs are accessible, they're super affordable, and they get you management support every month for a very reasonable rate. And it's for individual managers, for your team of managers, for your entire company, and for executive leaders. And we've recently introduced nonprofit management memberships for our nonprofit folks who we just adore. And last but certainly not least, from now until January 31st, we're often offering a really great 30% off discount on any management programs that you sign on for. And so that seems to be a hit this year. So continue to reach out to us and let us know how we can best serve you. So with that said, thank you so much for joining. The next session is going to be on January 16th, and we're going to be focusing on the planning function and the evidence-based tactics for becoming a forward-thinking manager and really understanding that function and getting it right. Okay, well, that's it for this morning. Thanks again for joining. Feel free to reach out or follow along on any of our social channels. We're pretty much everywhere, and I'll see you next week.